Good evening to every one of you. We appreciate your being here tonight. This is the third out of 4 Wednesday nights that we've had sort of inclement weather, but many of you have braved that, and we were beset by sickness and bad weather for a couple of those weeks. But we still have some folks sick tonight. Michael Hackett's not able to be with us. He has the flu. And we hope he gets much better, and we'll be updating everyone on the sick in just a little while. Be turning to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25. Matthew 25 contains 3 parables. It is certainly one of the great chapters of the Bible. We have lots of great chapters, of course. Every chapter is important, and each one has its unique role and place in the overall scheme of the Scriptures. But this chapter is a continuation of what has been called the Olivet Discourse that Jesus delivered to his disciples not too long before he was crucified. These are the final 3 parables of a whole host of parables in the book of Matthew. And these 3 are really well placed because they have to do with the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of time. And so, as we study them, we must apply them clearly to when Jesus comes again and being prepared for that coming. It's not, is he going to come? It's when is he going to come? Because he will come. He said, I will come and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Someone has said that this chapter could be summarized in a very brief and yet concise way. We could take the first parable and say that the emphasis there is to be wise. Be wise. The wise and foolish virgins. So be wise. Verses 14 through 30 deals with the talent men, and the clear emphasis there is on faithfulness. The good and faithful servants in contrast with the servant who was not faithful. He didn't do anything with his talent. So the second section would be to be faithful. And then this third one that we'll be looking at tonight, verses 31 through 46, emphasizes the importance of being ready. Be wise, be faithful, be ready. Now those are 3 things that you could write in the margin of your Bible, and you could keep it there for a long time. I have some in this little testament, notes that I've made over the years, and they really come in handy sometimes. And they help refresh my memory about a lot of things. So be wise, be faithful, be ready. There's a man by the name of Warren Wiersbe that wrote a series of commentaries. And every one of those commentaries on, I believe it's on the books of, he may have done the whole Bible, but he did all the New Testament. And every one of them starts with a B. 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 You know, what are we supposed to be as Christians? And Wiersbe emphasizes that. I've read some of his material, and it's good. He makes a lot of good points. And we need to be wise, be faithful, be ready. In the parable of the virgins, we learned that we must be prepared, we must be alert, and we must be watchful. The virgins teach us that. It involves forethought, getting ready for the future. What lies ahead? You know, we all know that Jesus is going to come again. If we're Christians, we believe that, and we believe it with a very strong conviction. So it behooves us to be ready for that. I've read some of the histories about the wagon trains that made their way westward. And they all began with so much stuff in their wagon. And they wanted to carry maybe a big old pump organ, you know, like a lot of houses had back then, or some other thing that they just could not do without. And when the weather began to change and it was obvious that fall was coming on and they might not make it through the passes if they didn't speed up, they said you could follow those trails by the stuff that had been thrown off. I mean, good stuff, you know. But what's that good? What good is that stuff going to do you if you don't get there? You get caught in those passes through the mountains, you know, and it's, 60, 70 degrees below zero, wind chill anyway, and several feet of snow, and you're there. You don't make it. That's not going to do you any good. Well, we're that way sometimes about life, aren't we? We just got to have this. We got to have it. And it may be the very thing that will keep us out of heaven. But this parable of the virgins also, I found this little note that I thought was good, reveals to us that some things cannot be borrowed. Can't be borrowed. The 5 foolish virgins said, let us borrow some oil from you. Couldn't be. The wise virgins would not have enough for themselves. And so that should remind us there's some things that can't be borrowed. You won't ride into heaven on somebody's coattails. It's what we do that's going to determine that. And I know we're saved by the grace and mercy of God. But think of how many times the Bible uses the word shall in reference to our responsibility and in reference to pleasing God. That's the way you do it. Faith is not mere belief. Faith is something that causes us to want to do and to seek to do what God tells us to do. And that's what faith is. Not giving mere consent to a statement or something, you know. But so many people seem to think that, well, all you have to do is just believe. Well, if you understand what belief and faith really are, then I could agree. But there's a lot of people that think that it's just merely, giving consent to something instead of there being any action that results from that faith. Some things can't be borrowed. They must be bought. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a big deal or not, but the foolish virgins also, they all understood they had to have a light. You know, they weren't going to get in without having their own light.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something
That's a good point.
was a part of them had to shine. There had to be, and like you said, the wise ones, it wasn't their responsibility to instill in those others that light. They had to have their own light.
That's right.
And I've always wondered if that didn't really kind of refer to faith.
Yeah.
You know, you don't get in on somebody else's faith.
That's right. And had they borrowed from the wise, and they were supposed to be, remember that part of that processional that went from one house to the other, what would have happened to all their lamps probably? They'd all gone out, wouldn't it? So there wouldn't have been any processional or any light on the part of the wedding party. That was their role, to carry those lights, whether they were torches or lamps. We talked about that word a little bit. Now, some things can't be borrowed. Furthermore, once lost, there are some things that cannot be regained. I think that's a good point for us to remember. Some things once lost cannot be regained. There are opportunities that we have for good, and once they pass, once that door of opportunity is closed, we can't bring that back. We can't regain it. And I think that's something that all of us need to remember. Opportunity may knock more than once, but there'll come a time when it'll knock its last time. And, if we're not ready, then we're going to be lost. Any other comments? All right, let's go to and look at the parable of the talents just briefly again, to remind ourselves that followers of Christ are to be responsible stewards. What is a steward? Not a Stewart now. We had a lot of Stewarts in Jackson County. It ended with a T. Now, I used to get that confused. I didn't know whether they were saying stewards, their name was stewards, or they were Stewarts. Overseer. Somebody that takes care of something that, what? Yeah, belongs to somebody else. Aren't we all as human beings, in a sense, stewards? People talk about climate change and all that and saving the environment and so on. But I grew up on a farm, and we learned pretty quickly. I mean, my dad knew about rotating crops and doing all this stuff, I'd wonder sometimes, why don't we just put it back right there? Well, you can't grow tobacco on the same ground over and over and over again without taking a lot out of the ground. So he'd move things. He'd sow some alfalfa sometimes, and then we'd sow wheat, or not wheat, but oats, and we had a lot of Lespedeza in those days. He'd plant corn. He grew up on the county farm in Jackson County, and they would farm one side of the hollow this year, run their cattle on it next year, and farm this side. And they rotated their crops that way. So you learn that very quickly. Of course, some of us in Jackson County never did learn that if you clear everything off those hillsides and you don't put grass on them, they're all going to be down in the delta. So you have to learn that. But we're stewards of those things. We ought to want to take care of them. But as Christians in particular, we are stewards of God's blessings, and we use those blessings in a way that pleases Him. And in the parable of the talents, each servant or slave was entrusted with a talent or talents according to their several ability. So God gives us all abilities. All of us have the ability to do something, and as members of the church, we may think sometimes, oh, there's nothing I can do, but you can. You can make a phone call. If you're not physically able to make a visit, you make a phone call, you can send a card. You can do all kinds of things to encourage people, and you can speak an encouraging word to a young person, somebody that's going through a difficult time. And I've seen the people here respond time after time in so many ways that lifted spirits and encouraged others, and that's what all of us need to do. That's being a good steward. When Jesus comes again, each one of us is going to give an accounting because we're responsible beings. And we're going to do that individually, as we'll see in just a few minutes. Don't bury what needs to be used. Don't bury what needs to be used, because we will lose it. I believe it's Miss Dimple spoke up last week when I asked, what happens to her talents if we don't use them? And she said, we lose them. And that's right. I know people who been maybe professional singers or musicians, and they will get away from it for a while, and then you hear them play and they'll say, I'm rusty. Well, an athlete or whoever you're thinking about, they have to stay at it and at practice. They have to practice. The Christian doesn't quit in this life. We retire with a retirement that's out of this world. We need to remember that. We don't retire as Christians. We just keep on and be faithful even unto death. But there'll be a lot of us that began with one talent, but we don't have to just end with one talent. We can develop that talent, and over time it can grow into several talents. The one talent man in that parable had no faith really in his master's fairness and goodness, because the master had placed enough faith in him to give him that talent. But he did not believe in the fairness and faithfulness of his master to reward him and recognize him as a faithful servant. And as a result, he didn't use that talent. We've got to be reminded always that God is faithful. He is faithful. Now, any comments anybody like to add on that one?
You have to wonder
Yeah.
how many opportunities or chances we wasted because of fear, and that was a lot of this guy probably was.
That's right. He feared failure, maybe. He just feared whatever. But I think that's one of our big problems. I've said it, and I'd say all of us would be honest and say, well, I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing. Well, we might say the wrong things sometimes. We may have to apologize. But we should have enough confidence and faith and hope in us that we would say something. Sometimes it's better to keep your mouth shut and not say anything. We all know that. But still, we fear failure sometimes, and we've been talking about that a little bit in our men's training class. I've had people in the church, men who would say, I just can't do that. I just can't get in front of a crowd. Or I can't read the Bible in public. I can't stand up here and read the scriptures. But after they once do it, they get to where they can, do it. And I've used this story that I was familiar with growing up. There used to be a man and a woman in a congregation in Jackson County. She would always sit with her arm around him on the back of the seat. I can see that till this day. He was a terrible reader. But in that particular class, and several classes where I went to church back then, went to 2 different congregations. We didn't have Wednesday night services at Antioch at that time, and so we went out to McCornsville. And this man struggled mightily with reading. His wife was sitting there with her arm around him, and she would whisper in his ear what the word was. And it might just be and, the, but, or by. I went back there many years later, several years later, and I heard him read. And he read the Bible as well as anybody I've ever seen. Now, if he had been afraid, he'd have never grown to that point. He ended up serving as an elder in that congregation.
Or if she hadn't been a good wife.
You better believe it. She was a good wife. But we can encourage one another in that regard. So don't be afraid. you probably don't have a single fear that somebody else hasn't had. You know,
We used to go to McCorn when we go up to Joe's grandparents,
yep.
and there was a man that didn't read very well, but he read real fast, and when he come to a word that he didn't know, he'd say it so fast, nobody didn't know that he didn't.
There was another fellow there at McCoynesville. I remember this guy. One night they were reading Matthew 1, chapter 1, Matthew, that genealogy. And everybody was buffaloed. But Brother Buck, B-U-C-K, he was the Watkins man in Jackson County. And I don't know whether he pronounced all those words correctly or not. But he read that as fluently as anybody I'd ever heard. And I thought, man, he's a brave guy. But he wasn't afraid. We need to all learn from people like that. Let's go to the final parable now. Beginning in verse 31. Let's read it together. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations. And he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? And when saw we thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was an hungered, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in. Naked, and you clothed me not. Sick, and in prison, and you visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, or athirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto thee? Then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Notice the word not in that last section. But I want us to go back to verse 31 and look at some of these things. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory. I would urge you to mark, at least in your mind, maybe in your Bible, the Son of Man. The Son of Man. Who is that? That's God's Son, Jesus, the Lord. He's going to come again. Remember what he's talking about. Go back to chapter 24, the first few verses. Lord, tell us about when these things are going to happen to Jerusalem and your coming. So he's telling them now about his coming. Notice the emphasis that is placed on the glory that will accompany him. Think about that. Try to visualize that. I don't think that we're capable of it as human beings. I'm going to be preaching a sermon sometime before long about the vision that Isaiah saw in Isaiah chapter 6 when he was called to be a prophet to Judah. And he talks about seeing the glory of God in the temple. You think what a powerful vision that was. Think about how powerful it will be to see that in person. How powerful it would be to see the Son of Man coming in his glory and all the holy angels with him. Now, I don't understand everything about angels. I'm not an authority on angelology, I guess some would call it. But we have quite a bit of material in the Bible about angels. And one of the things that they are described as doing is harvesting. They're like harvesters. And that seems to be the thought here in this passage. They will, and it's interesting to me that he says all of them will come with him. Does that mean every single solitary angel? It would seem like it, wouldn't it? Jesus said that he could call legions of angels. How many is a legion? I've forgotten. Anybody help me out on that? That'll be our assignment for next week. Everybody go home and find out how many a legion is. But you think about all the angels will be with him. Now, if you go back, let's go back just a minute, chapter 13. I've written that down here or typed it down here. In chapter 13, in verse 39, the enemy that sowed them that's talking about the tares, is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, notice, and the reapers are whom? The angels. The reapers are the angels. Look at verse 41. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them that do iniquity. And then there's one more verse in that chapter, verse 49. So shall it be at the end of the world. The angels shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just. So those passages shed light on this passage in Matthew 25. The angels in all their glory. That vision that Isaiah saw in Isaiah 6 seemed to have angelic beings involved in it too. Notice then the third thing is he will sit on his glorious throne. How many of you have ever seen literally in person, a king on his throne? I haven't. I've seen the Queen of England several times, and she looks just like a lovely little grandma to me. I mean, she don't look like some great woman, but I'm sure she is to her family and so on. She ought to be anyway. But some of the ancient kings had marvelous thrones, but there's not ever been a throne that'll be like the one that is occupied by Jesus. The next thing that I want you to notice in that first verse of this parable is he says that verse 32, before him shall all the nations be gathered. All nations. Now, there are some people who think that all nations simply refers to Gentiles. I don't think that's the case. The Jewish nation would be included in this too. They're going to be judged too. And the word for nations, I understand from reading Greek authorities, say that that's neuter gender, and that's like a thing. But when he goes on to say, and he shall separate them, that's masculine, denoting individuals, human beings, mankind. And he's not going to judge the nations, the whole nation, and say, well, this is a righteous nation. Individuals within each nation is going to be judged. We shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and each one of us will receive according to the deeds that we have done in the body, won't we? That's what 2 Corinthians 5 and Romans 14 and a whole lot of other passages tells us. But just think about all the nations. Now, when do we next read about all the nations? In Matthew. Go and teach what? All nations. That's exactly right. You teach all the nations were going to hear the gospel. And that included the Jews along with the Gentiles. That's another reason that you shouldn't conclude that, it's just Gentile nations. It's going to be all nations. Now here is another very important point. He shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. Now, that last statement, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats, signifies that this is a parable. That's one of the things. It's a comparison. One thing is laid alongside the other. And we see the parallels there. Just as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats, we'll talk more about that next time. How many of you have ever had goats and sheep on the same farm? Anybody? I was wondering about that today. We didn't. We never had any goats. We had sheep, but you had sheep? Did you have goats with them? No. They just don't seem to go together. One thing that I found was that the shepherd would usually divide the sheep from the goats in the evening or at nighttime, because the goats needed to be inside to be warmer. The sheep like to stay outside. I wonder why. Yeah, they had plenty of wool, didn't they? So they would stay warm. And when I still remember Dad shearing the sheep, and Roger and I would help him hold them, and I felt so sorry for those creatures when he got through shearing them, especially if it turned a little bit cool, had one of those spells. Yeah, they but sheep don't like water. They don't like to be around water or have to be swimming in water, because the wool gets so heavy. It's uncomfortable for them. So there were reasons why the shepherd divided his sheep from the goats. We'll talk more about that next time, Lord willing.